You might have noticed lately the Trump campaign is being, some might say, us amongst them, uncharacteristically on message. Trump's trashing autonomous vehicles the day of Musk's event aside, they have been really on message, and the message has been immigration. Now, part of the reason the Kamala campaign is in such a state of panic that she's actually going on Fox. She's going on Fox tomorrow for an interview with Brett Baer. Probably these numbers. So these numbers show Trump gaining on her, although she's still ahead in the polling for what it's worth. But this is what's really relevant here. The ABC News Ipsos poll found that 56% of Americans favor deporting all undocumented immigrants, up 20 points from a Washington Post ABC News poll 8 years ago. The poll also found that Trump maintained a 10-point lead in trust to handle immigration. And in what I think is a related number, in the ABC News poll, about 59% said the economy is getting worse. Among registered voters who say the economy is getting worse, Trump led Harris 74% to 21%. Now, I think that is very significant because I can't imagine it's not a majority of people in the country who feel the economy is getting worse. So if you've got that kind of a majority of people who feel that way, that bodes pretty well for Trump. And I am sure there is significant overlap in the Venn diagrams that our VP come candidate adores so much between the people who feel that all the undocumented immigrants should be deported and the people who are also saying that the economy is getting worse. So, hey, it's a smart thing for them to lean into. Setting aside the politics of it, we'll take a look at the points that J.D. Vance just made in an interview with a New York Times reporter that got a lot of coverage. This is Lulu Garcia Navarro, and you'll be able to see very clearly in this video part of the reason why it's working so well for them politically. Not only the nuts and bolts of the immigration issue, but it very much plays as a class issue, which to a large extent it is. In this interview with J.D. Vance, she very quickly seems out of her depth, out of touch, and very elitist in the arguments that she's making. But we'll get into that. All right, so let's take a look at this interview.
The reason that there is a housing crisis is that not enough houses have been built.
And that we have 25 million people who shouldn't be here.
Well, I mean, this is the thing.
I think it's both.
I know you do. I don't think that many people who look into this agree with you, but about a third of the construction workforce in this country is Hispanic. Of those, a large proportion are undocumented. So how do you propose to build all the housing necessary that we need in this country by removing all the people who are working in construction?
Well, I think it's a fair question because we know that back in the 1960s when we had very low levels of illegal immigration, Americans didn't buy houses, didn't build houses. But of course they did. And I'm being sarcastic, of course, in service of a point, Lulu, the assumption that because a large number of home builders now are using undocumented labor, that's the only way to build homes. I think, again,
the country is much bigger.
The
need is much bigger. I mean, I'm not arguing in favor of illegal.
Okay, so right there, what the hell is she talking about? The country, the need is bigger, the country is bigger, so's the population. Like, what the hell are you, what? Yeah, so there are more people to take the jobs too. We don't have a greater need with the same population we had in 1965. The whole thing is just off the beam. And as somebody
the big difference is that corporations don't want to pay people anymore. That's the biggest change from the 1960s. Right. So Vance is incorrect, too. Vance is being reductive as well by acting as if, well, the only variable here is that we didn't have illegal immigrants in the 60s, and so we had Americans building houses. The other point of this is that corporations don't want to pay people to build houses. Well, they don't pay people to do anything.
Well, I don't think he's not making that point. He's making the point that they want illegal immigrants here so they don't have to pay Americans.
Sure. But I think one oversight of this, and we will let this play because I'll make this point more thoroughly later, he's assuming that corporations and developers will lift supply to meet demands. And that's not always the case, but we will let it play a little more.
Sure, that's not always the case, but also one point that I will make just from my own experience. Yes, construction used to be considered a really good job for a blue collar worker. That was one of those things you wanted to start apprenticing on work sites. You'd start out lifting the cinder blocks, and you'd pick up a trade and pick up a skill, and it was a good paying job. And I saw that happen. I saw that happen to my best friend, man. He was in construction, and over time it got harder and harder for him to make a living because a lot of illegal immigrant labor came into the workforce, and he couldn't match that. He could not match what they would charge to paint your house. They would just charge half of what somebody who's not going to be living in an apartment with 6 other people would charge. So this is what libs really miss when this conversation comes up. This woman is not in a field where she has to worry about that. She doesn't know anybody who's ever experienced that. I experienced it when I used to drive a horse and carriage. They had a lot of people come in who were not supposed to have those jobs legally. They were not legally allowed to have those jobs. And it really destroyed the labor conditions in that business. So I experienced it in a business I was in myself. So what she's saying, this is part of why Trump and Vance resonate when they talk about this, because on the other side, you have these libs who are completely out of touch.
Immigration, I'm asking how you would deal with the knock-on effect of your proposal to remove millions of people who work in a critical part of the economy.
Well, I think that what you would do is you would take, let's say, for example, the 7 million prime age men who have dropped out of the labor force, and you have a smaller number of women, but still millions of women prime age who have dropped out of the labor force. You absolutely could re-engage folks into the American labor market. This is, I think,
to work in construction?
Of course you could.
The unemployment rate is 4.1%. Most people
unemployment rate, Lulu, this is important.
But most people who don't work can't work in the regular economy. They're in the military, they're parents, they're sick, they're old. They might not want to work in construction.
The unemployment rate does not count labor force participation dropouts. And again, this is one of the really deranged things that I think illegal immigration does to our society, is it gets us in a mindset of saying we can only build houses with illegal immigrants when we have 7 million, just men, not even women, just men who have completely dropped out of the labor force. People say, well, Americans won't do those jobs. Americans won't do those jobs for below the table wages. They won't do those jobs for non-living wages. But people will do those jobs. They will just do those jobs at certain wages. And think about this from the perspective of an American.
Okay, but hold on a second. Okay. Who's going to pay them those wages? That's the question I would ask to J.D. Vance. That's the other piece of this that you don't really get from Trump and Vance. Who would pay them these wages? What we learned during COVID, as the lockdowns lifted and as society got back to normal, is that you had, during the lockdowns, obviously, a tanking of demand. And then as the lockdowns lifted, you saw an explosion of demand. And that's where we saw the quote-unquote supply chain crisis, where corporations couldn't ramp up supply sufficiently to meet demand. And what happened? Inflation. Well, it wasn't always the case that they couldn't increase supply. They just figured, why should we? Why should we? If demand is exploding and workers are starting to demand fair wages, we'll just make less shit and charge way more for it. Who's to say housing developers won't do the same thing? Now, what would be a solution to this if you said, we are going to do a new deal. We're going to have a massive public works program where the government is going to build housing units, and we are going to pay these underemployed men and some women, as he says, living wages to build houses. Don't hold your breath for that coming from Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. So yes, this issue works for them because she's a fucking imbecile. She has no idea how to make this argument. And she can't make that argument because they're pro-capitalist as well. But the point of this that I want to drive home is that part of the reason why they go to the immigrants are coming and they're raping your wives and they're kidnapping your daughters and they're eating your cats, they have to make deportation a political payoff in and of itself. They have to make you feel like just getting rid of these people is a win, because they are going to find a way, working class men, listen up, they're going to find a way to fuck you anyway. They're going to find a way to fuck you anyway. That's what Democrats and Republicans and businesses and real estate developers always do. They always find a way to fuck the working man anyway, and they're going to continue long after the illegal immigrants are gone.
Yes, that may be true. However, when you look at what they're discussing here on the face of it, he is addressing something that the liberal class, as represented by this reporter, are completely unequipped to address.
Well, yeah, I said that.
Now, will they not build houses, figuring, well, why not build less houses and charge more money rather than to build the amount of houses that society needs in order to drive down the price? It's possible. It's possible. And certainly government tax incentives to incentivize development to make it financially worthwhile not to go in that direction should be part of the equation. But in terms of what they're talking about, do these corporations, I've had this stance throughout the crisis at the border. I have never accepted the premise that they cannot seal the border with the world's largest military by orders of magnitude. I've always considered that absurd on its face, that a president cannot declare a state of emergency and use this enormous military we have to seal the border. So when you've got that many people coming over the border, they want that many people coming over the border. And I thought when AOC started talking about how we have got to give them work permits, that's giving away the game. But right when labor union movements are starting to regain strength for the first time in 40 years, all of a sudden you have this crisis at the border. So, yeah, the fact that Trump and Vance may not, in our opinion, be trustworthy in terms of what they would do the day after these mass deportations to help working people. The argument itself is resonant because in many ways it's true.
Right. And I think part of the reason it resonates is because that element is true, that corporations want to exploit cheap immigrant labor. But it doesn't just fall to Trump and Vance. This is where the Ayn Rand model comes in. This is Atlas Shrugged. All right, you're going to make it too expensive for us to build houses? We just won't build them. We'll just charge double for the ones that we already have built, and whoever doesn't want to pay it can live on the fucking street. Fuck you. Fuck you.
Right.
That's what they're going to do. The working people are not going to get a good deal out of mass deportations. They are going to feel like they got a good deal because of the fear-mongering around immigrants as this big safety risk. That's part of why they demagogue about this issue, is because they want you to feel like getting rid of them is a win in and of itself, even when there is no economic payoff. And in my opinion, there will not be, because control of the housing market is being consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, to the point where these companies are going to be able to do whatever they want or as little as they want, and they will get just as rich either way.
Perhaps, but you're jumping ahead to the next problem.
I understand.
The question here is what they're proposing the evil, bigoted premise presented as by people like this reporter? And I would argue no. Now you're talking about, well, how does it need to get sorted out afterwards?
Right.
But in terms of the idea that it is driving down wages in certain industries, and that's what its purpose is, he's absolutely right.
Sure, that's what they want out of it. There's no question about that. The argument
they're not really going to address the problem properly, that's the next problem.
Sure. I just want people to be ready.
Yeah.
I don't want people to be duped into thinking they're going to get a great deal once the immigrants are gone, because they're not.
Well, sure.
Okay. I want them to go searching in their own country for their own citizens, sometimes people who may be struggling with addiction or trauma, get them re-engaged in American society. We cannot have an entire American business community that is giving up on American workers and then importing millions of illegal laborers. That is what we...
That is maybe the most important thing he says here to me, because my next argument, my real argument to this would be the working class has been broken by decades of economic dislocation and disenfranchisement. They're rife with drug addiction and psychological illness. The fact that he's addressing that head on, I wouldn't have expected, honestly, because to me, that's part where we're going to get to in part B, another hole in this plan, structurally. But to me, that's one of your biggest obstacles. What did the guy say in Springfield about why he was hiring the Haitian workers? Because they're not on drugs.
Well, I mean, this is part of Vance's, I won't say it's part of his brand, because I think it is more sincere than that. It's part of his backstory, right? I mean, he grew up in one of these areas. That's what his book was largely about. So he's kind of, I won't say uniquely equipped, because he kind of, got taken under the wing of some very rich and powerful people. So he's not quite the rags to riches story that you think about when you think about working with your hands all the way up. No, not exactly. But he does come from that background, so it's not surprising to me that he went there. And he can speak to this fairly well when he wants to. I thought his convention speech spoke to issues like that fairly well, too.
Right.
We have, thanks to Kamala Harris's border policies. I think it's one of the biggest drivers of inequality. It's one of the biggest reasons why we have millions of people who have dropped out of the labor force. Why try to re-engage an American citizen in a good job if you can just import somebody from Central America who's going to work under the table for poverty wages? It is a disgrace, and it has led to the evisceration of the American middle class.
So I really don't, and you make valid points, but I really don't disagree with anything that he's saying there. The question of, okay, well, will they create, it sounds like what he's suggesting, and in another part of the interview, he explicitly says that the government needs to help people, that the government needs to create programs to help people. And that's kind of implicit in what he's saying here. You bring in these people who have maybe fallen victim to drug abuse and psychological illness, and you rehabilitate them back into the workforce. I mean, that's a policy nobody could really take exception to.
Well, I mean,
if they followed through and did it, which of course is the $1 million question.
Right. The $1 million question is, do they actually take the next step and make sure that these houses get built with American labor that's paid a dignified wage? Boy, there is not too much evidence to suggest that the Republican Party is going to follow through on that. But
sure,
there you have it.
Sure. But they're addressing an issue that the Democratic response to is bigotry. You're a bigot, you're a racist.
Right.
If you have any concerns about this, you're a Klansman.
Well, and also just a complete infantilization of working people. Well, what, are we going to get Americans to build houses? Well, why the fuck not? Why wouldn't Americans build houses? Right. We can't build houses? I mean, I can't build a house. That's why I'm a podcaster. But a real man could.
She makes an argument for cheap immigrant labor right there, which they very often do if you push them on this, because they live in such a bubble where they are so immune to the impacts of those kinds of policies. Well, do you want to pay more for a TV? Right?
Exactly.
They go. That's right where they go. All right. So now, in keeping with the whole party and Trump surrogates seeming to be on the same message, Tucker Carlson gave a speech about this that really invokes part of what's so effective about it, which is the class element. It is a great proxy by which even a very rich heir like Tucker Carlson can sound like a class warrior speaking on this subject, because a lot of what he says here has the virtue of being absolutely correct, and we have evidence that it's correct. So let's see what he said.
Why don't we send 15,000 Haitians to your neighborhood and then call you racist when you don't like it? Or 50,000 Belgians. It doesn't matter. People who aren't from where you're from into your community. How about we do that in Martha's Vineyard, and then we'll do it in Bethesda? You know what I mean? Then we'll do it in Aspen. And then we'll try it in Jackson Hole. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do it in Bel Air, California? No, I'm serious. Why don't we do it in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and every one of the richest suburbs of Boston? We're just going to move 50,000 Haitians into every one of those towns. And if you don't like it, if you dare to move, we're going to call you racist on the front page of the New York Times. Why don't we try that? And why don't we do it at gunpoint, actually? And of course, we're not going to do that because the people who live in those towns are doing it to you. And it's an act of hostility. And they've cowed the rest of us into silence with moral blackmail. Well, they live in places like, and by the way, I spent a lot of time in all of the towns I just mentioned, so I know exactly what they're like. And they don't have high density housing, or whatever the hell they're calling it, public housing, projects. They don't have any of that. And they don't have mass immigration at all because they don't want it. And they're imposing on the rest of the country, and they're going to impose it on this state big time. And I'm sure they're doing it now. I'm just guessing, but I just know what they're like. And this is the kind of place they don't like because you tie your boats together in the summertime, and the sight of that drives them insane. Because you're loyal to your neighbors to a greater extent than you're loyal to them. So they must destroy that loyalty by diluting your communities and destroying them.
Okay.
And one more thing. Why are their condiments so spicy? Why do they put cayenne pepper in everything? Why don't they ever have just a nice white creamy condiment? Why don't they eat mayonnaise?
You know, that potato salad, it's bad for your heart, but it's good for your soul.
Everything. The most mild salsa that you'll get is a tomatillo. And even that's a little hot for me because I'm an American. I shouldn't apologize for that, should you? Why?
That's how you keep the immigrants away.
Yeah.
Don't put so much spice in everything. It attracts them. Everybody knows that.
Yeah. There's nothing worse than a white person who likes hot sauce.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
All right, so I kept in that last part because I think it illustrates pretty well how many figures like Tucker Carlson weave together elements of what I think are honest and truthful observations of the hypocrisy of the liberal class, and then they take it to the crazy place. Yes, no, liberals are not hating them because they tie their boats together and hate their neighbors. Liberals hate them because they challenge their orthodoxy. They challenge their power. They are perfectly happy with people who tie their boats together, who bend the knee to the liberal class and its ethos and the Democratic Party. But they tie all this together into it's an old rhetorical device, the Voke. You are the Voke. You are the salt of the earth. You are the good people, not like these urban sophisticates, not like these elites. Now, part of the reason that's often so effective is there's often an element of truth in it. So I'm surprised he didn't bring this up because he presented it as speculative doing this to Martha's Vineyard. Texas Governor Greg Abbott actually did do this to Martha's Vineyard, and Martha's Vineyard was not as happy about immigrants coming to their community as they are about them coming to others, just as Tucker lays out here. 50 migrants went to Martha's Vineyard, which, by the way, Martha's Vineyard has the highest number of vacation homes in the country. And this was in the off season. So there were plenty of empty houses. They made it sound like their sewage is going to be backing up any second because of the 50 migrants straining their infrastructure. So let's see some of these wonderful specimens of humanity.
So,
what are the most difficult challenges right now?
The difficult challenges are we have, at some point in time, they have to move from here to somewhere else, right? We don't have the services to take care of 50 immigrants, and we certainly don't have housing. We're in a housing crisis as we are on this island, and so we can't house everyone here that lives here and works here. We don't have housing for 50 more people.
We're tapped out.
50
Yeah.
people in one of the wealthiest enclaves in the nation, and they are calling people who are screaming ouch when you put tens of thousands of people in their small towns. They're bigots for complaining about the strain on schools, on public services. 50 people in Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, Martha's Vineyard.
Now, if we had real artists, honestly, looking at this painting, if we had real artists, when you go to the museum, instead of seeing, some image of somebody twerking with a fist up their ass, you would see this painting as a satire of the liberal class, as an illustration of the disgusting hypocrisy of the liberal class. This would be a great painting. Look at this woman. They have kicked out the 50 immigrants. I think it took a few days before they moved them to a military base. Look how proud this woman is, because they gave them like juice boxes or something.
Right.
They gave them like a bagged lunch. Look how proud she is of herself. Like, they've been so wonderful to the immigrants. The level of self-delusion is just astounding. So let's see. Oh, they're so happy sending these migrants to a military base. Ti amo.
Ti amo. Ti amo.
Volunteers who had worked around the clock to provide shelter, food, and clothing to the 48 immigrants waved goodbye. These people are really, they are, and this is why that kind of rhetoric is effective. And I'm sure it's no different now than it was 100 years ago. The liberal class, these liberal class elites, are disgusting people. They're an easy target in any age. They're always an easy target because they're always like this. One rule for me and another rule for thee. And something the New York Times reporter or anyone of her ilk will never bring up is part of the reason the housing costs are so high is because people like this use their economic, political, and cultural clout to pass laws not allowing development of low-cost housing in their areas. That's part of why we have a housing shortage, because they built their little enclaves and they pulled the ladders up behind them to make sure that the poors couldn't follow them in.
Yeah. Te amo. Now get lost, though.
Get lost. And look how proud she is.
Get on the bus, so. Yeah.
Look how proud she is. The only person who might do that painting, I'll give him some respect. He does do things like this every now and then. Banksy.
There you go.
Maybe that's part of why he's so popular.
Please clap.